All right, let's do power rankings, Jeff. Who's got honors, me or you?
It's your show, Gill. You got the honors.
That doesn't mean I have the honors. Ladies and gentlemen, power rankings, top 10 National Football League. Now, remember the highlights, if you will. Not all of highlights, but the headlines for my power ratings last week were the fact that I had the Chargers number 1. Ooh, that didn't age well. But I did have the Titans number 9. That did age well. So basically, here's the shift now. We'll go to this week's power rankings, and I'm just talking about how I feel about these teams on a neutral right now. The Chiefs remain at number 10 for me. So the Chiefs, even in victory over the Washington football team, there was nothing about their performance there that made me want to elevate them or drop them. Yes, they win the game, but Patrick Mahomes still has a bad pick. Their defense is still horrible. Seriously, watch the one Washington touchdown. Watch the tape of that touchdown, their only touchdown in that game. There are 2 Washington wideouts clear beyond the Kansas City defense. You never see anything like it. It's like they had invisible cloaks going through the defense, and then they're like, oh, we probably cover those guys. And Taylor Heineke had his choice. So Kansas City remains number 10. Now, the team that dropped out of the top 10 is the Cleveland Browns, because with all the injuries that we just discussed last segment, they are the Niners from last year. You get to a point where you cannot overcome injuries anymore. And with the Browns, it is just cluster after cluster. So they're out of the top 10, partially not through any fault of their own, maybe mostly through not any fault of their own. So Baltimore was the beneficiary of that. I took them from 11 last week up to 9. They obviously crushed the Chargers. I'm not going to overreact on any 1 week from the previous week's rankings. Titans move up from 9 to 8. Packers move up from 8 to 7. Cowboys move up from 7 to 6. Still refuse to put the Cowboys in the top 5, but they're getting there. So really that whole 6 to 10 is just the Browns dropping out, the Ravens going in, and then everybody else really elevating one, except for the Chiefs, who remain at 10. Then the top 5. The Rams remain at number 5, again, much like with the Chiefs' win over Washington. I don't know what we learned about the Rams and their win over the Giants, other than Daniel Jones still loose with the football. And so the Chargers do drop from 1 to 4. Some might argue I should drop them further. I'm not willing to do that. The Chargers are a tough one to rank because with the volatility of Brandon Staley's fourth down decision-making, you're going to have some really bad-looking outcomes. Though I would argue they got crushed comprehensively, period. It had nothing to do with the fourth down risky calls this past week. So Chargers drop all the way to 4. And yes, I know Baltimore crushed them, and Baltimore's 9, and the Chargers are 4. But I'm not going to overreact from 1 week's rankings to the other. Arizona up to 3. Tampa Bay up to 2. Buffalo up to 1, even in defeat. So the Chargers had to drop significantly. And 1 to 4 are pretty significant in my rankings. But all those other teams, sort of like the 6 to 10 and the 1 to 5 worked the same way for me. The 5 and the 10 remained where they were as placeholders. And then everybody else, the Chargers dropped in the 1 through 5. Everybody elevated 1 spot. The Browns dropped out in the 6 for 10. Ravens got in, and everybody else elevated 1 spot. You, same 10 teams reshuffled? Jeffrey Parles?
We have the same teams in a different order.
There it is.
And I think at this point, you and I were discussing this last night via text. I do 11 or 12. Once you get past 10, it's a pretty significant drop-off, at least to me, to 11.
There's a cliff after that.
Which I have as the Raiders as my 11th.
I think I had the Bengals as my 11th.
The Bengals are the other team that I would consider in that, but it's a giant difference. So let's look at this list for me here, and it is a new number 1 as well. I have Arizona up to the top spot after their thrashing of Cleveland, and look, it took me a while to buy them, and I understand that Cleveland falling out of both of our top 10s, it's injury-related more than anything. But that game, the only reason that game said you had a thought like, oh, maybe Cleveland might have a shot here, was because of a fluky Hail Mary. Other than that, that was an utter evisceration where Arizona was so clearly better than a Browns team in their own building. Yes, I know the Browns were battered, but that's still a game where if you're not quite ready to take the leap, you mess around and could lose that game.
And Arizona didn't have their head coach.
Yeah.
Should be noted.
No Cliff Kingsbury, no Chandler Jones, who's arguably their best pass rusher. That defense is legitimately great at this rate.
The 2 most eye-opening wins of this season, it could be argued, are both Arizona wins. Their thrashing of the Browns and their beatdown of the Rams. So if they're not in your top 3, I mean, they have to be your top 3, for sure.
At worst, number 3 for them.
Yep.
You could even argue that Week 1 win against Tennessee, in retrospect, looks
Maybe
incredible
so.
now because that game was never competitive. Going back to the list, the Rams move up to number 2. I know beating the Giants isn't the most impressive thing, but that was another one that after the first 6 minutes, total beatdown. And I trust McVay. I think that defense is still top 5 in the league. And that's why those teams are ahead of Dallas, who they didn't move in my rankings. Mike McCarthy is going to be the downfall of this team at some point.
He will be.
It's going to happen. So Dallas in at number 3. Buffalo falls from 2 to 4. Even in defeat, they fall less than the Chargers. Again, I think the reason that I have the Bills one slot ahead of the Chargers, who I have at number 5, it's the kicking game. Tyler Bass is really good, and Vizcaino is a bad kicker. The Chargers need to clean that up.
Cannot be emphasized enough, because we talk about it on this show. We don't make enough about field goal kickers. That is the Chargers' bugaboo. They just, and by the way, it's their franchise history bugaboo. They can never get it right. And clearly they have no confidence in Vizcaino, and probably justifiably so.
Absolutely. Chargers fall to 5. I don't want to. Originally, when I was going through this, I had them all the way down to 8, but that felt too excessive to move them 7 slots on one result. So to me, 5 through 8, there's really no difference between the Chargers, who I have at 5, Tampa, who I have at 6, Baltimore, who I have at 7, and Green Bay, who I have at 8. I think if you put any of those teams in that order, you could sell me on it, but that's the order that I'm going with the Chargers, just because the fourth down variance, we knew this game was coming at some point, Gill, where they were going to get destroyed. The fourth downs weren't going to hit. It's still going to be closer to a 60% play on those fourth downs.
So, a few comments. One, Matt Brown, Kelly Bidlin, and I on Primetime Action, and now you here on a numbers game. All 4 of us had the same 10 teams in our power rankings, just reshuffled. How many years do you think we could have gone 6 weeks into an NFL season and have 4 guys have the exact same 10 teams in the top 10 of the power rankings?
Maybe 1.
Maybe ever.
Maybe 1.
And what does that tell us? That tells us that we talk about this in baseball all the time, the ever-increasing widening of the gap between the haves and the have-nots, the chasm that there is in baseball. Well, maybe this is just an incremental widening of it in football, but it's happening. Like Pete Rozell's dream of parity any given Sunday, sure. I mean, listen, I had the Rams against the Jets last year, so you can't tell me it's not there on any given Sunday. But I would argue the parity is less now, and it is decreasing. And yes, there's a cliff after 11 or 12, because then what do you get into, the Saints and the Panthers of the world? You know, if we did this from the bottom up, 32 would be the Texans.
I would have 32 Texans, 31 Jaguars, 30 Jets. The bottom 3 is pretty clear.
Giants aren't in there.
Miami is probably in there.
Miami's the most surprising of the bunch in terms of what we thought of preseason. Miami would be the one team where you'd be like, huh. And the 500 team or better, that's the worst in power rankings, probably the Chicago Bears for me at 3-3, way down the list. It's interesting to go through this. It does give you some sense of where you should think about these teams on a week-to-week basis with spreads. Although this week, week 7, it didn't help at all. Trust me on that.